I remember the day I first stepped off the plane onto American soil. My right leg bandaged tightly from hip to ankle, my military duffel bag slung over my shoulder. I was a broken soldier returning to a home I thought would provide warmth and comfort. My heart pounded loudly in my chest, each thump a painful reminder that I was no longer the strong, agile recruit I had once been. Instead, I was limping, my kneecap shattered in combat, held together by rods and surgical pins, the muscle around it a patchwork of scars. Yet, despite this injury, I felt proud to have served my country, proud that I had fulfilled my commitment and earned an honorable discharge. Little did I know, however, that my return was not the happy homecoming I had always imagined. Instead, it was the beginning of a betrayal that threatened my very sense of self. My first indication that something was off came when I was still in the hospital, just 2 weeks after my discharge. My mother arrived with a sullen look on her face, her eyes darting nervously around my sterile white room. My father stood behind her, his stance rigid, hands clasped together in a show of forced support, as if he'd rather be anywhere else than by my side. It stung, seeing the reluctance in their faces. Part of me wanted to scream out, to ask if they realized how much I needed their love, but I stayed quiet, determined not to push them away with my anger. I was a soldier, after all, trained to endure both physical and emotional pain. When I was finally cleared to leave the hospital, I waited for my parents to offer me a ride back to the modest apartment I had been renting before my deployment. Instead, my mother stiffly suggested that I stay in my childhood bedroom until my leg healed further. It wasn't so much an invitation as it was a command, and I, still needing assistance with day-to-day chores, reluctantly agreed. My father, silent as ever, simply turned on his heel and walked away, leaving my mother to guide me to the car. My father's muteness unnerved me. Growing up, he had been the strong, silent type, rarely showing affection but never failing to provide for us. However, I sensed an unfamiliar tension in him, a discomfort that permeated the air like an acrid smell, impossible to ignore. During my first week at home, I spent the majority of my time in bed, leg propped up on a stack of pillows. My mother insisted on preparing my meals, feeding me a barrage of high-calorie dishes as though she feared I might waste away. Still, she wasn't entirely gentle. She dropped the plate on my lap without so much as a kind word, her eyes averted, as if even looking at me was an imposition on her part. If I asked her for something, an extra pillow, a glass of water, she'd sigh heavily before retrieving it, remarking that I should have more self-reliance. My father, meanwhile, only appeared in my room late at night to check on me, his face illuminated dimly by the hallway's fluorescent light. He'd stand there, nod once, and then disappear without a word. My younger brother, Derek, had been staying out late most nights. When I did see him, he barely acknowledged me. In many families, the returning war hero might be treated with respect, or at the very least some curiosity. But in my house, Derek seemed more offended by my presence than anything else. I heard the fragments of conversation between him and my parents through the thin walls. They whispered about money, about ownership, about how Derek felt overshadowed by me since childhood, and about my father's dream that Derek would make something big of himself. Yet, nothing could prepare me for the shock I felt when I accidentally overheard their plan to make me sign over my newly purchased property. You see, while I was overseas, I had managed to save and invest my disability pension, as well as the majority of my combat pay. I had bought a modest house in a decent neighborhood, planning to settle there once I returned. It wasn't a mansion, of course, but it was mine, a piece of security I had fought for. The knowledge of that property had given me hope during the darkest nights when gunfire roared across the desert and the threat of IEDs loomed around every corner. When I'd lie there, anxious and exhausted, I'd remind myself, when this is over, I'll have a home to call my own. That promise kept me sane. But the plan my parents were weaving with Derek threatened to rip that dream away. I remember sitting up abruptly, my leg throbbing, when I heard my father's gruff voice through the door. "We'll use this as a stepping stone," he had said. "If your brother signs the house over to you, you can take a loan against it, start that business we talked about. He doesn't really need it, anyway. He's got a guaranteed disability pension. It was an outrageous statement, laced with an appalling sense of entitlement. My mother's voice followed, her tone dripping with agreement. He owes us, after all we've done for him. It's time he realized that we make the rules around here. Besides, you're going to have a family. You'll need a bigger place, a real investment. In that moment, I felt as if the floor had fallen away beneath my feet. All my life, my parents had favored Derek, but never before had they stooped this low. My family, the people I had always wanted to impress and serve, were casually discussing how to manipulate me into forfeiting the one thing that gave me peace. Rage and betrayal welled up inside me. My hands clenched into fists, nails biting into my palms, but I resisted the urge to burst through the door and confront them. Deep down, I knew I needed to plan my response carefully. I was a soldier. I had experience with strategy, with gathering intelligence, with anticipating the enemy's moves. These skills would now be turned inward against my own flesh and blood. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the white ceiling, the moon casting faint silver shadows across the room, I began plotting my counterattack. The first step was to gather evidence, proof that my parents and Derek were conspiring to cheat me out of my property. My father had always been the practical one, the type to insist on thorough documentation for every financial transaction. This could be used to my advantage. Over the next couple of days, I acted oblivious, pretending I hadn't overheard anything. Despite my heart hammering in my chest, I forced a smile whenever my parents entered the room, and I swallowed the bitterness that threatened to spill whenever Derek was around. I recall the day they finally approached me openly about my property. My mother came in first, wearing a forced smile that never reached her eyes. "How are you feeling?" she asked, her voice tinged with feigned concern. "A bit better," I replied softly, feeling the sting of deception behind her question. My mother tried to look sympathetic, but her smile faltered as she glanced at Derek, who stood in the doorway, arms crossed over his chest, staring at me with cold eyes. "We've been talking," she continued, "and we think you should consider letting Derek manage your house. Sign some documents that give him authority while you're recovering. It would be good for him, and you wouldn't have to worry about anything." My heart pounded. This was it, the moment I dreaded. However, I kept my face neutral, adopting an expression I often used in the military when confronting sensitive intelligence. "Why Derek?" I asked casually. My father appeared, his footsteps echoing in the hallway before he entered. He cleared his throat. "Because he needs a place, son," my father said, the corners of his mouth tightening. "He wants to start a business, and it would be easier for him to secure financing if he has property to leverage." I looked at Derek, whose eyes were unwavering in their arrogance. He smirked ever so slightly, as though relishing the power play. I wondered if he felt any shame. "He's your flesh and blood," I thought bitterly, "and yet, he is so eager to take everything from you." But I kept my composure and did my best to appear thoughtful. "Can I think about it?" I asked in a measured tone. My father nodded solemnly, while my mother forced another thin-lipped smile. Derek merely shrugged. "Don't take too long," he said with a smirk. "Opportunity waits for no one." Once they left, I exhaled deeply, forcing my trembling hands to steady. I realized in that moment that the fight had officially begun. What they didn't know was that I had a plan of my own, quietly forming in my head, shaped by the experiences of analyzing battlefield situations and outsmarting the enemy at critical junctures. In war, brute force alone doesn't guarantee victory. You need strategy, resources, and sometimes a little cunning. While confined to my bed, I used my laptop to consult with the Veterans Administration, as well as legal experts who specialized in military law and benefits. Initially, I kept my questions broad, seeking to understand the best ways to protect my assets. I discovered that, under certain circumstances, any attempt to coerce a disabled veteran into relinquishing property could be considered financial exploitation, a serious offense. Additionally, I started looking into the property itself, verifying my ownership, ensuring my name was the only one listed. I double-checked all legal documents I had carefully stored in my online cloud, confirming that the mortgage and title were solely under my name. When my leg had recovered enough for me to hobble short distances with a cane, I decided it was time to visit the house. I told my parents that I wanted to do a final inspection before making any decision, to which they begrudgingly agreed. Derek rolled his eyes, annoyed that I was taking so long, but I ignored him. My father drove me to my new place, a small two-bedroom house with a garage and a neat front lawn. The sight of it filled me with warmth, a glimpse of what life could be like once I was fully independent again. Inside, the walls were a dull beige with only a few pieces of furniture, just enough to make the place livable. I let my father guide me around on my cane, my leg throbbing slightly. I took note of every detail, touching the walls, checking the windows, letting the space affirm my sense of belonging. This was my place, paid for by my blood, sweat, and tears on the battlefield. I would not yield it without a fight. My father cleared his throat. So, do you think you'll sign it over to Derek? Or at least give him co-ownership? He asked, unable to mask the eagerness in his voice. I slowly turned to face him, leaning heavily on my cane, measuring my words carefully. I'm considering it, I replied. But I also have a lot to think about. This is my pension, my future, and I have to be absolutely certain. He pressed his lips into a thin line. You know, your mother and I only want what's best for you, he insisted. But we also have to think about Derek. He's got potential, and this property could be the difference between him thriving and just getting by. The corners of his eyes were tight with tension. I nodded but remained non-committal. I couldn't afford to reveal my hand yet. Instead, I pretended to be lost in thought, giving an impression of a dutiful son who merely wanted to weigh the pros and cons deep down. However, my anger burned. My father was so transparently manipulative, tossing in mild guilt trips about family duty. Yet, for all his talk about what's best, his concern seemed to vanish when it came to me. He didn't mention how a stable home was crucial to my physical and mental rehabilitation. He never acknowledged the possibility that I might want to start a family someday, or that I might need this investment for my own future. No, the only focus was Derek. Over the following weeks, the pressure intensified. My mother's tone became sharper. She would remind me every morning, in the brief moments she lingered in my room after dropping off my breakfast tray, that Derek was growing impatient. Your brother needs an answer, she'd say, her voice laced with agitation. He has investors interested in partnering with him, and they need collateral. You have the means to help him. Why are you delaying? Each time, I offered a polite nod, feigning confusion, telling her that I had to speak to my lawyer. The mention of a lawyer always made her eyes widen slightly, and she'd retreat quickly from the conversation, muttering something under her breath about how I was making everything more complicated. Behind closed doors, Derek fumed. I would catch snatches of conversation while pretending to be asleep. He'd hiss, "He's doing this on purpose." And my parents would try to calm him, urging him to give me more time. Derek's resentment solidified into open hostility. He stopped pretending to be polite. On more than one occasion, he sneered at me in the hallway, or deliberately knocked my cane to see if I'd stumble. Each time, a hot wave of fury washed over me, but I kept my cool, refusing to retaliate. By playing along, I was giving them all the rope they needed to hang themselves. During this period, I worked quietly with a local lawyer, an old friend of one of my veterans advocates, who specialized in real estate and knew how to spot the legal pitfalls of family disputes. We formed a plan designed to expose their manipulation and protect my rights. She advised me to gather as much evidence as possible, including any paperwork my parents or brother might give me to sign. Meanwhile, I also researched how a restraining order or protective order could come into play if family members were financially abusing me. My lawyer assured me that the law wasn't blind to such predatory behavior, even if it was coming from one's parents or siblings. As my parents' and Derek's campaign reached a fever pitch, my mother finally confronted me one afternoon in my room, slamming the door behind her. "Enough stalling," she snapped. Her cheeks were flushed, and her arms were crossed tightly. "You've been home for weeks. Your leg is healing, and you're no longer bedbound. Derek needs you to put your name on those documents. What is the holdup?" I watched her for a moment, letting her anger hang in the air. Then, with the sweetest tone I could muster, I said, "I've thought everything through. I'm ready to sign the necessary paperwork, but I want to see it first, and I want to have my lawyer look it over." My mother's face softened slightly, relief evident in her eyes. She likely believed they had finally worn me down. "All right," she agreed after a moment of hesitation. "I'll tell Derek and your father. We'll have the documents drawn up." Within 2 days, my father handed me an envelope filled with legal documents. Derek hovered behind him, practically salivating at the idea of claiming my property. My mother watched intently as I opened the envelope, my cane leaning against the armchair in our living room. The papers spelled out everything: a transfer of title, a quitclaim deed, and a power of attorney that would allow Derek to make any financial decisions regarding the house. It was more than just a co-ownership. These documents essentially stripped me of all rights. The only thing I'd be allowed to do was live there at Derek's discretion. It was insulting, outrageous, and thoroughly transparent in its goal. Yet, I pretended to weigh each page carefully, flipping through them slowly as though my heart wasn't pounding in anger. Finally, I looked up. "I need time to have my lawyer go through these," I said, not bothering to hide my distaste. Derek scoffed. "What's there to look over? We're family, aren't we? You either trust us or you don't." My father shot him a warning glance, silently telling him to back off, but Derek's face remained twisted in frustration. "Fine," my mother said brusquely, "but don't take too long." She snatched the envelope from my hands and shoved it back at me. Later that night, I scanned every document into my computer and sent them to my lawyer. We spent an hour on the phone dissecting every clause. As expected, it was a blatant attempt to wrest control of my house. By signing these papers, I would be left with almost no legal recourse to get it back if Derek decided to evict me. Worse yet, my parents had tried to incorporate language that implied I was willingly gifting the property to Derek. It was all the proof I needed that my family intended to defraud me, and that was precisely what we would use to enact our plan. It took several days for the final pieces to fall into place. My lawyer prepared a letter, carefully worded, informing my parents and Derek that I had become aware of their financial exploitation. It stated that if they continued to pressure me or attempted to coerce me into signing over my property, I would have grounds to pursue legal action. Along with this, she recommended that I temporarily relocate to my own house. Despite my leg's lingering weakness, I agreed. The only way to reclaim my life and stand up to my family was by physically and symbolically moving away from their influence. I will never forget the morning I decided to leave. My leg still hurt, but I could manage short distances with my cane. I had packed my belongings quietly the night before, stuffing clothes and personal items into 2 duffel bags, determined not to alert my parents. At the crack of dawn, while the house was silent, I hobbled down the stairs and slid into my old car, which was still parked in the driveway. For a moment, I paused, staring at the front door of the house I had grown up in, recalling memories of a time when love hadn't seemed so conditional. Just as I was about to turn the ignition, Derek appeared on the porch in his pajamas, arms folded across his chest. "Where do you think you're going?" he demanded, stepping onto the lawn. My chest tightened, but I forced myself to stay calm. "I'm leaving," I said simply. "This has gone on long enough." Derek's jaw clenched. "You can't just leave. We have an agreement in the works." I let out a short, humorless laugh. "That agreement was never signed. You and our parents have no say in what I do with my property." He glared at me, but didn't advance any further. Perhaps he sensed a change in me, a determination that wouldn't buckle under his threats. Without another word, I reversed out of the driveway. My hands were shaking. My heart felt like it was going to hammer right out of my chest, but I managed to keep the car steady. As I turned onto the main road, I felt a wave of relief wash over me, mingled with residual anger. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. My parents and Derek would not let me walk away that easily, but at least I was making it clear that I would no longer be controlled. Over the next few days, I settled into my own house, even though it lacked many comforts. Furniture was sparse, and I had no reliable help if my leg gave out. However, a few of my army buddies, local veterans who lived nearby, rallied to assist me. They brought over second-hand furniture, helped me install a few accessibility features in the bathroom and the kitchen, and offered me moral support. Their loyalty and kindness reminded me that there were people in the world who actually cared about my well-being, who valued me for more than just my assets. Meanwhile, my parents bombarded me with phone calls and text messages, alternating between threats and guilt trips. Some messages were cold and angry, telling me how ungrateful I was for all they'd done, warning me that I'd regret forsaking the family. Others were tearful, particularly from my mother, lamenting how I was tearing the family apart. Derek also sent a barrage of menacing texts, claiming I had betrayed him, that I was a selfish cripple who was hoarding property he didn't deserve. My lawyer advised me to save every single message. The stack of evidence grew each day, strengthening my case should I need a restraining order or legal protection. Eventually, my parents showed up unannounced at my doorstep. My father banged on the door with such force that the walls rattled. I peered through the living room window, seeing my mother's distressed face and Derek pacing angrily behind them. My lawyer had warned me this might happen. Summoning my courage, I opened the door but remained inside, leaning on my cane for support. "What do you want?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. My father's face was red, anger fueling his every gesture. "We want to talk," he growled. "You're acting irrationally, son. This is not how family treats each other." My mother's eyes were filled with tears, but I couldn't tell if they were genuine. "We never meant to hurt you," she insisted. "We just wanted to help Derek get a head start in life. He's younger and he needs it more than you do. You have your pension." "Stop," I cut in, unable to control the tremor in my voice. "I heard everything before you tried to persuade me. You planned to take my house, my only sense of security, because you think Derek's needs are more important than mine. I put my life on the line for this country. I came back with a shattered leg, and all you care about is him. Did you ever think about what I need?" Derek spat on the ground, eyes burning with hatred. "You're making a big mistake," he hissed. "Don't you see we're trying to help you too? You can't take care of this place by yourself in your condition." I narrowed my eyes. "That's for me to decide. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm calling the police if you don't leave." My father stared at me, his face contorting with a mix of fury and what I hoped was shame. My mother stood there, tears rolling down her cheeks, but offering no apology or acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Derek, shaking his head in disgust, turned on his heel and stomped off the porch. My father looked as if he was about to say something, then thought better of it and followed Derek. My mother lingered for a moment, lips trembling, but in the end, she scurried after them. I watched as they piled back into the car and drove away, the tires screeching on the pavement. My legs felt weak not just from my injury, but from the emotional toll of standing up to them. I closed the door, locked it firmly, and sank into my armchair. A mixture of sadness and relief washed over me. Despite my resolve, it hurt that my own family had forced me into such a confrontational stance. Part of me wanted to collapse in tears, lamenting the loss of the familial bond I'd once valued. But another part of me, stronger and more resolute, reminded me that I had done nothing wrong. Over the next few weeks, their attempts to contact me slowed. Perhaps the realization was setting in that I had the upper hand, legally and morally. My lawyer sent them a formal cease and desist letter, stating that any further harassment or attempts at coercion would result in legal action. Derek tried a few more times to intimidate me via text, but my lawyer responded on my behalf, making it clear that we were prepared to go to court if necessary. Eventually, even Derek's messages dried up. Still, my father's final words haunted me. "This is not how family treats each other." What a twisted interpretation. If only he had recognized that the true betrayal was their willingness to cast aside my well-being in favor of Derek's ambitions. As the nights grew quieter and their presence in my life receded like a fading storm, I focused on healing. My leg grew stronger with each passing day, aided by physical therapy and the unwavering support of my army buddies. Gradually, I could walk longer distances without the cane. I set up my living room with comfortable furniture, arranged the photos of my old unit on the mantel, and made the house feel like a home. During this time, I also sought therapy for the emotional wounds. A wise counselor at the VA center helped me navigate the betrayal, teaching me coping strategies for the guilt and anger swirling inside me. She reminded me that it was okay to prioritize my needs, especially after enduring trauma. It was liberating to hear someone say that I had the right to cut ties with those who only brought harm into my life, even if they were family. Gradually, I started sleeping better at night, no longer jolting awake from nightmares of both combat and familial betrayal. Weeks turned into months, and each day brought small victories. I set up a workshop in my garage, tinkering with old electronics and building small gadgets as a form of therapy. I applied for remote jobs that catered to veterans, allowing me to work from home. The house that had once been so empty now buzzed with possibilities, each creaking floorboard reminding me that this was my space, earned with sweat, blood, and unwavering perseverance. One morning, the doorbell rang unexpectedly. My heart lurched, half fearing that Derek or my parents had returned for a final showdown. But when I opened the door, I found a woman and a young child standing there, each holding a small potted plant. It took me a second to recognize them. Neighbors from down the street, whom I'd met briefly while collecting my mail. The woman smiled warmly. "We just wanted to welcome you to the neighborhood properly," she said, offering the plant to me. The child, probably around 6 years old, beamed up at me, extending his own little succulent. My chest tightened, not with anger, but with gratitude. These strangers had shown me more kindness than my own family. "Thank you," I managed, my voice thick with emotion. "That's really thoughtful." They stayed for a while, chatting about local stores, the neighborhood watch program, and upcoming community events. Their genuine warmth further soothed the wounds left by my parents' betrayal. Gradually, I learned to accept that sometimes blood ties do not guarantee loyalty or love. The house became my sanctuary, a place where I could heal, physically and emotionally. My disability pension covered most of my expenses, and the remote job I found allowed me to indulge in my passion for tinkering with electronics in my spare time. I made new friends in the neighborhood, bonded with fellow veterans at the local community center, and embraced a life free from the oppressive dynamic of my family's favoritism. Then one day, out of the blue, my mother contacted me again. This time, though, the message was markedly different. No threats, no guilt trips, just a simple, "I'm sorry for everything. Can we talk?" I felt my stomach tighten. Doubts rose up like old ghosts, and I wondered if this was another ploy, another manipulative gambit. Yet, a part of me longed for closure or at least some sense of understanding. After discussing the matter with my therapist, I decided to meet her in a neutral public space, a small cafe near the edge of town. When I arrived, my mother was already seated at a corner table, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. She looked older than I remembered, her hair streaked with more gray, her eyes tired. She stood when she saw me, but I gave only a small nod before sitting down opposite her. For a moment, neither of us spoke. A thick tension hung in the air, an invisible reminder of the pain that had passed between us. Finally, she spoke. "I deserve your anger, and I'm not here to make excuses," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "But I am here to tell you how deeply sorry I am." I studied her face, searching for deceit. To my surprise, I found genuine remorse. She took a shaky breath and continued, "Your father and we got so wrapped up in Derek's future that we forgot about yours. We saw your military service as something that made you strong, as if you didn't need us anymore, while Derek was so obviously helpless in many ways. It was wrong. We took you for granted. We pressured you into signing away your property because we thought it was the easiest path to get Derek on his feet. But we ignored how much you sacrificed for us and for this country. That was unforgivable." I stared at my own hands for a long moment, fighting the knot in my throat. Memories of the betrayal still stung, but I also recalled times before all this mess. Christmas mornings, 4th of July barbecues, my mother's gentle lullabies when I was a child. Why are you telling me this now? I asked softly. She closed her eyes. Because Derek's business plans failed. He spiraled into debt, and your father is furious. He blames me, I blame him, and Derek blames everyone but himself. The house scheme didn't happen, and now the banks are chasing Derek for money he borrowed. Meanwhile, we realized how badly we treated you. She paused, her voice breaking. We lost you in the process. Her words were heavy with regret, but I held my ground. You didn't just lose me, I said, voice shaking slightly. You pushed me away. I came home, injured and traumatized, and all you saw was a resource to exploit for Derek. That's not just a mistake. That's cruelty. Tears slipped down her cheeks, and she nodded. I know, and I'm not expecting forgiveness overnight. But I had to say this, had to let you know how I feel. My coffee sat untouched, growing cold. Slowly, I inhaled, letting the tension in my shoulders ease. I don't know if I can trust you again, I admitted. She reached out a trembling hand toward me, but stopped short, as if afraid to cross a boundary. I understand, she whispered. We talked for nearly an hour that day. She explained how Derek's sense of entitlement had grown, fueled by my father's favoritism. She admitted her own failings, how she never stepped in to stop it. Now Derek was floundering, resentful, blaming everyone for his failures except himself. My father had retreated into silent bitterness, while my mother felt trapped in the aftermath of a fractured family. If you never speak to us again, I'll understand, she said quietly. But I want you to know, I'm so proud of you for your service, for your strength, for building a life without us when we gave you no choice. I couldn't find the right words to respond, so I left with a promise to consider everything she said. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts a turbulent sea of emotion. I knew the scars ran deep, and that rebuilding any semblance of a relationship would take time. Part of me wanted to cast them out of my life forever. Another part, though, yearned for a family, for some sense of reconciliation. My therapist reminded me that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting or excusing what happened, but rather acknowledging it and choosing to move forward in a healthier way. In the following weeks, I maintained minimal contact with my mother through cautious text messages. She kept her tone apologetic, never once demanding anything. Derek, on the other hand, remained silent. I heard through my mother that he was staying with friends and facing legal troubles related to unpaid loans. My father also did not reach out, and I suspected his pride prevented him from admitting his wrongdoing. Perhaps that was for the best. Some bridges are too damaged to rebuild. Life continued, and gradually, the bitterness in my heart dulled. My leg grew stronger, and I found a steady rhythm in my new normal. Then one day, out of the blue, my mother sent me a text. Your father had a health scare. He's in the hospital. Don't know if you want to come or not. I felt a pang of concern, mixed with lingering resentment. After a few agonizing hours, I decided to visit. Maybe it was the soldier in me who refused to turn a blind eye to someone in need, or perhaps it was a final vestige of familial duty. When I stepped into the hospital room, I found my father hooked up to various machines, his face pale, eyes half closed. My mother sat at his bedside, and Derek leaned against the wall, looking worn down and stressed. An uneasy silence fell as they noticed me. My father's eyes flickered with shame, then relief, but I didn't move closer immediately. Instead, I stood in the doorway, gripping my cane, less for physical support now, and more for emotional grounding. It's his heart, my mother murmured, breaking the silence. He collapsed at work. The doctors say he'll need surgery. I approached the bed, my father's gaze fixed on me. I saw something in his eyes that I hadn't seen for a long time. Vulnerability. I didn't think you'd come, he croaked. My grip tightened on the cane. I came to make sure you're all right, I said simply. Derek cleared his throat, looking away, his posture tense, clearly embarrassed by my presence. To my surprise, my father reached for my hand, his grip weak but persistent. Son, he rasped. I'm sorry. Tears swelled in my eyes against my will. I recalled how I had once yearned for his acceptance, how I had tried to earn his respect by enlisting and serving valiantly. "It's okay," I lied, because it wasn't fully okay. But in that moment, I saw a fragile old man, regretful and scared, no longer the unyielding pillar who had tried to manipulate me. My mother quietly wept, watching our exchange. Derek stayed silent, occasionally glancing at me with an unreadable expression. The surgery was scheduled for the following week. In that time, I visited a few more times, exchanging awkward words and half-smiles. Derek and I barely spoke, though we shared the same waiting room, both worried about our father's outcome, both ignoring the elephant in the room. My father's surgery went smoothly, and afterward, as he lay in recovery, I decided I had to face Derek at last. I found him in a nearby hallway, leaning against the wall, eyes closed, exhaustion etched into every line of his face. "How are you holding up?" I asked softly. He opened his eyes, blinking in surprise. "Fine," he said tersely. I nodded, leaning on my cane. "I heard about the trouble you're in," I continued. "I'm sorry it turned out that way." Derek scoffed. "Don't pretend you care. You left me high and dry. You had the property, the chance to help me, but you ran off." Anger flared inside me, but I kept it in check. "I had every right to protect myself," I said, trying to keep my voice even. "You would have left me with nothing if it meant you got what you wanted. Don't expect sympathy for that." Derek glared at me, but then his gaze wavered, and he slumped his shoulders. "You're right," he admitted, voice barely above a whisper. "I was a jerk. I thought I deserved it more. I was jealous that you got a pension, that everyone called you a hero. I messed up." We stood in strained silence. Part of me wanted to reach out and hug my brother, to revert to the childhood days when we'd wrestle on the living room rug or play catch in the backyard. But those times felt like another lifetime. "It's not too late to turn things around," I offered quietly. "But I'm not going to sign over my house, and I'm not going to bail you out of your debts. You need to fix that yourself. If you can do that, and if you can accept that our relationship is going to take time to heal, maybe we can figure out how to be brothers again." Derek looked at the floor, then back up at me. I could see the turmoil in his eyes. He gave a small nod, though he didn't say anything. That was enough for me at that moment. A tiny crack in the wall of hostility between us, a hint of remorse that might be the foundation for genuine change. In the weeks that followed, my father recovered slowly. My mother decided she wanted to repair our relationship in a meaningful way, not just with words but with action. She visited me at my house, helping me plant a garden in the backyard, offering me homemade meals without the usual undertone of obligation. She kept her apologies brief, not wanting to harp on the past, but I could sense her genuine intent to do better. My father, still weak from surgery, sent me occasional text messages that read more like postcards. Checking in, "How's the leg?" Or, "Hope all is well. Love you." It was awkward, but there was a tentative bridge forming between us. Derek, for his part, found part-time work to slowly pay down his debts. We kept our interactions limited, focusing on civil small talk whenever we found ourselves in the same room at the hospital or during family gatherings. Over time, his bitterness seemed to wane, replaced by a cautious respect. At one point, he even confided that he understood now how hard I had worked for the house, for the pension. "I'm sorry for trying to take it," he said one evening, sitting in my living room with a mug of coffee. "Mom and Dad convinced me it was the only way I'd get ahead. But it was wrong. I know that now." I nodded. "It's going to take a while for me to trust you again," I admitted. He sighed. "I know," he whispered. But in that moment, I saw a flicker of the brother I used to know, the one who would chase fireflies with me in the backyard long after bedtime. Maybe we weren't beyond saving after all. Bit by bit, the tension in the family eased, replaced by a fragile, new start. We all understood that our relationships were permanently altered, that the betrayal couldn't simply be forgotten. However, there was a collective desire to learn from our mistakes, to rebuild in a more honest and empathetic way. My parents no longer pushed me to sign away my house. In fact, they rarely brought up Derek's financial woes. They seemed to realize that parental support doesn't mean sacrificing one child to uplift another. Months turned into a year, and by then my leg was nearly fully healed. I still had a slight limp, but I no longer needed a cane for most activities. My house had transformed into a cozy haven, a place filled with memories of friends' laughter, the smell of fresh coffee in the morning, the hum of my electronics workshop in the garage. My life, though marred by scars, both physical and emotional, felt stable and genuinely happy for the first time in years. On the one-year anniversary of me moving into my home, I decided to host a small gathering. I invited my close friends, my army buddies, a few neighbors, and, after much thought, I extended an invitation to my parents and Derek. I wasn't sure if they'd show up, but I wanted to extend an olive branch to show them that despite everything, I was open to forging a healthier dynamic. To my surprise, they all came. My mother brought homemade casserole, my father carried a bottle of sparkling cider, and Derek arrived with plates of pastries from a local bakery. The atmosphere was initially tense, but it gradually warmed. Friends mingled, conversations flowed, and there was a genuine sense of celebration in the air. At one point, a neighbor asked how I had managed to afford the house, and for the first time, I spoke openly about my disability pension from the military. My father didn't bristle or interject with a remark about Derek's needs. He simply listened, nodding quietly, seeming to respect my journey. Later in the evening, Derek caught me in the backyard, where I was tending to the small vegetable patch I had planted with my mother's help. "Nice tomatoes," he joked, kneeling down to inspect the plants. I smirked. "Yeah, hoping for a good harvest," I replied. We talked idly about the garden, about my therapy, about his job. The conversation was light, unburdened by resentment. Finally, Derek looked at me, eyes earnest. "I know I've said it before, but I want you to know that I really am sorry for what happened," he said quietly. "I can't change the past, but I want to be a better brother." I placed my hand on his shoulder, feeling a lump in my throat. "I'm willing to try," I said. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves overhead, and for a moment, I felt the weight of the past lift. We would never erase what had happened, but maybe, just maybe, we could move forward as a family that respected each other's boundaries and dreams. Over time, our lives continued to intertwine, but in a healthier way. Derek focused on building a business the right way, without trying to exploit anyone. My parents turned their attention to enjoying their retirement years, rather than orchestrating manipulative schemes. And I found peace in the home I had fought so hard to keep. I put down roots in the community, volunteered at the local veterans center, and even started mentoring younger soldiers who were transitioning back to civilian life. Looking back now, I realized that my parents forcing me, a disabled veteran, to sign over my house to my brother had been the catalyst for one of the hardest battles I'd ever fought. In many ways, it was more challenging than anything I had faced on the battlefield, because it struck at the heart of what I believed family should be. The betrayal cut deep, but through perseverance, legal savvy, and the support of true friends, I managed to protect what was rightfully mine. In doing so, I also forced my family to confront the toxic favoritism and manipulation that had plagued us for years. Was it painful? Yes, unbearably so at times. But did I emerge stronger, more aware of my worth, and ultimately happier? Absolutely. My family still has its cracks, and some scars may never fully heal, but we found a tentative resolution. By standing my ground, I taught them that betrayal has consequences, and that respect is not something you demand but something you earn. Today, I sit on my front porch, the soft evening sun casting long shadows across the neatly trimmed lawn. My leg twinges occasionally, an old war injury that lingers like a memory, but it doesn't define me. My house stands as a testament to resilience, a daily reminder that I have the right to chart my own path. Derek drops by sometimes, carrying leftover pastries from his now thriving cafe, a business he managed to start with honest hard work and modest loans he took out responsibly. My parents phone regularly, asking about my day, my health, my hobbies. They've learned to check their favoritism or at least keep it to themselves. And so, the story ends on this gentle note of cautious reconciliation. I'm at peace because I defended what was mine while still allowing the possibility of forgiveness. My house remains in my name. No signatures relinquished, no intimidation endured, and no regrets about the stand I took. I've shown my family their mistake, yet I've also opened the door for a healthier future. Sometimes the hardest battles we face are the ones that take place not on foreign soil, but right at home. And in this battle I claimed my victory and my well-deserved happy ending.